Hello everyone, and I'm here to guide you into a peaceful slumber. If you find this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know where you're from and what time it is as you unwind. So, settle in, get cozy, and let the relaxation begin. The trading post sat like a weathered sentinel at the crossroads of nowhere and forgotten, its adobe walls the color of dried blood in the late afternoon sun. It was 1993, and while the rest of the world rushed headlong into the future, this corner of the Navajo Nation seemed to exist in a permanent state of twilight, caught between the old ways and the new. I stood in the dim back room, breathing in the pungent mixture of old leather, dust, and something deeper. Something that spoke of generations of stories traded across worn wooden counters. My name is Joshua Treehorn, and I'd spent the last decade drifting between odd jobs across the Southwest, each one taking me further from who I used to be. The woman behind the counter, Loretta, according to her name tag, sized me up with the kind of careful scrutiny that came from years of separating truth from lies in a place where both were traded as freely as turquoise and silver. "You any good with horses, Mr. Treehorn?" she asked, her voice carrying the slight rasp of too many cigarettes and too many years of desert wind. "One of the best," I assured her, ignoring the twinge of guilt at the slight exaggeration. It had been years since I'd sat properly in a saddle, but desperation has a way of making you remember skills you'd rather forget. The reservation was suffering through its third year of drought, and work was as scarce as rain. Loretta's eyes narrowed, reading something in my face that I thought I'd hidden better. "Got a fellow who might take you on," she said slowly, "but he's particular. Need someone who can handle the quiet." "You a talker, Mr. Treehorn?" A ghost of a smile crossed my lips. "I've been known to spin a yarn or two." The truth was, I'd learned the value of silence in my years alone. Sometimes the stories you don't tell are the ones that keep you alive. That seemed to satisfy her. She scribbled an address on a crumpled receipt, her handwriting as jagged as the mesas that dominated the horizon. "Head north towards Shiprock. He's about 10 miles out. Big old white ranch house, got a horse barn behind it. Name's Walter Duncan." She paused, something flickering behind her eyes. "Tell him Loretta sent you." I'd heard whispers about Walter Duncan in the bars and cafes that dotted the reservation like lonely stars. They said he was touched by something out there in the vastness, that he talked to his horses more than people, that he kept loaded rifles by every window of his house. Some said he'd seen things out in the desert that had turned his hair white overnight. Perfect. When you're running from your own shadows, sometimes the best place to hide is in someone else's darkness. The sun was beginning its slow descent as I guided my battered Ford pickup along the rutted dirt road that led to Duncan's ranch. The land out here was different from the tourist-friendly vistas closer to town. Here the desert showed its teeth. Raw, red cliffs jutting up like broken bones, sparse vegetation clinging to life with stubborn determination. The silence was absolute, broken only by the labored breathing of my truck's engine and the occasional cry of a hunting hawk. As I crested a rise, the Duncan Ranch spread out before me like a mirage. It was bigger than I'd expected, at least 1,000 acres, maybe more. A sprawling white ranch house dominated the property, its paint peeling in the relentless sun. Behind it, a massive barn listed slightly to one side, as if bearing the weight of untold secrets. But it was the horses that caught my attention first. There must have been 30 or 40 of them, scattered across the pastures like dark chess pieces on a board of burnt grass. They were beautiful animals, mostly quarter horses from what I could tell, but something about their behavior set off warning bells in my mind. They moved restlessly, clustered together in tight groups, their heads up and nostrils flaring. These weren't the lazy, sun-drowsed horses you'd expect to see on a late afternoon. These animals were afraid. Walter Duncan was waiting for me on the porch, a tall, lean figure silhouetted against the dying light. He didn't move as I parked and stepped out of my truck, didn't offer any greeting or gesture of welcome. He just watched, still as a rattler before the strike as I approached the house. "Mr. Duncan, Loretta at the trading post sent me. I'm Joshua Treehorn, here about the work." He studied me for a long moment, his face weathered as old leather, eyes the pale blue of winter sky. When he finally spoke, his voice was surprisingly soft, almost gentle, but edged with something I couldn't quite name. "You believe in things you can't see, Mr. Treehorn?" It wasn't the opening question I'd expected from a potential employer, but years of living on the reservation had taught me to respect the roundabout way conversations sometimes needed to unfold. "The old stories?" I shrugged. "Some truth in them, I suppose. Spirits. Skinwalkers, maybe." Duncan's eyes narrowed, and I saw something flash across his face. "Relief? Recognition? Not stories," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Things, out there in the darkness, things that don't follow the rules." He turned abruptly and pushed open the heavy wooden door, gesturing for me to follow him inside. The interior of the ranch house was like stepping into another world, or perhaps another time. Taxidermied animals lined the walls, their glass eyes reflecting the last rays of sunlight that filtered through dusty windows. The air hummed with a low, persistent buzz I couldn't quite place, and the smell, something beyond the expected musty scent of an old house, something metallic, almost electric. Duncan pointed to a worn leather armchair and waited until I sat before he began to pace, his boots making no sound on the thick Persian rug that covered most of the floor. "Something's been at my herd," he said without preamble. "Killing horses, not for food, for sport almost seems." He stopped pacing suddenly, fixing me with that pale, intense gaze. "The thing out there, it's not right, not natural." I felt my heart begin to thud against my ribs, though I couldn't have said exactly why. This was why folks kept their distance from Walter Duncan. The man wasn't just odd, he was touched, as the elders would say. I chose my next words carefully. "Look, whatever's bothering your horses, maybe it's a mountain lion. Maybe coyotes got too big for their britches. I'm a decent enough tracker. Can help you find it, put it down." But Duncan wasn't listening anymore. His focus had shifted, his entire body going rigid as he stared at a point over my shoulder. Following his gaze, I felt my blood turn to ice water in my veins. There, framed in the doorway leading to the kitchen, stood the largest, blackest dog I'd ever seen. Its eyes burned like embers in the gathering darkness, and a low growl rumbled in its chest, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere far deeper than any earthly creature's throat. But what froze me in place wasn't its size or its eyes. It was the shape of it, the way it moved. Wrong somehow, as if its body was assembled from parts that didn't quite fit together. "You see it, don't you?" Walter's voice was a hoarse whisper. "It's here, right now." I nodded, unable to speak. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to flee this house and this man and whatever hell-spawned thing stood before us. But some deeper part of me, a part that echoed with the old stories of my ancestors, kept me rooted in place. The dog thing took a step forward, its guttural growl escalating into something that made my teeth ache. It didn't move like a normal dog, its limbs too long, its joints bending at impossible angles. Walter reached under an end table, pulling out an old lever-action rifle with the smooth motion of long practice. "Can you shoot?" His voice was eerily calm now. "You bet," I said, surprised to find my own voice steady. "Then we might just survive the night," he said grimly, raising the rifle. "Thing is, bullets might not be enough." I took a steadying breath. I didn't know if I believed in monsters, but I believed in what I was seeing, and something told me this wouldn't be some simple hunt. This was something older, something that walked the line between the world I knew and the one I'd spent my life trying to ignore. The dog thing snarled and lunged, a blur of darkness and teeth. The night had only just begun. The creature moved with impossible speed, dodging Walter's first shot like it knew exactly where the bullet would go. The sound of the rifle blast echoed off the walls, momentarily drowning out the beast's growl. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled my nostrils, mixing with an older, foul a stench that seemed to emanate from the thing itself, like wet fur and rotting meat and something else, something that had no name in any human language. As Walter chambered another round, my mind flashed back to the last time I'd faced death. It was 5 years ago, up in the Chuska Mountains, when a routine hiking trip had gone sideways. I'd been leading a group of tourists, rich folks from back east who wanted to experience the real Southwest. The memory hit me with crystalline clarity, even as I dove behind an overturned table. "The legs," Walter shouted, snapping me back to the present. "Aim for its legs!" The creature had leaped onto his kitchen table, sending decades-old china crashing to the floor. In the dim light, its form seemed to shift and flow like smoke. But there was nothing insubstantial about the claws that left deep gouges in the wood. I'd started guiding tours after my father passed, using the skills he'd taught me about the land, the tracking, the survival techniques that had been passed down through generations. Dad had been one of the last true horsemen of the old school, equally comfortable in the saddle or reading weather patterns in the dawn sky. He'd tried to teach me everything he knew, but I'd been too eager to leave, too convinced that the modern world had more to offer than ancient wisdom and patient observation. The creature's claws raked across my shoulder, tearing through my jacket like it was tissue paper. The pain was immediate and intense, but different from any animal attack I'd experienced. It burned like ice, a cold so severe it felt like fire. "Joshua," Walter's voice carried a note of desperate command. "The fireplace. Remember what I told you?" What he'd told me. My thoughts were scattered, fragmented by pain and fear. Then it hit me, the old stories. The ones my grandmother used to tell around the fire on winter nights when the wind howled outside like a hungry thing seeking entrance. Stories of creatures that could only be destroyed by flame. The fireplace was maybe 15 feet away, an ancient stone hearth that looked like it had been here since the house was built. A few embers still glowed weakly among the ashes. Walter had mentioned matches earlier, but where? The beast lunged again, and this time Walter met it with the butt of his rifle, a solid crack that would have killed any normal animal. The creature barely seemed to notice. Its eyes, God, its eyes, they weren't just red now, they were changing, shifting through colors that shouldn't exist. "Your pocket," Walter grunted, struggling to keep the thing at bay. "Left them in your pocket." He was right. The box of matches was there, the weight of it suddenly the most important thing in the world. But as I pulled them out, another memory surfaced, this one darker, more recent. The real reason I'd left the guiding business, the real reason I'd been drifting from job to job across the reservation. It had been a cave, up near Canyon de Chelly. A simple day hike, nothing I hadn't done 100 times before. But something had been different that day. The shadows had been deeper, the silence more complete, and there had been tracks in the dust, tracks that made no sense, that seemed to start and stop at random, that belonged to nothing I'd ever seen in all my years in the wilderness. "Now, Joshua." Walter's voice cracked with urgency. "It has to be now!" I struck the first match with trembling fingers, watching the small flame spring to life. The creature's head snapped toward me, nostrils flaring. For a moment, just a moment, I saw something in those impossible eyes. Recognition, maybe even fear. The memory of the cave crashed over me again. The tracks had led deeper, and I'd followed them, ignoring every instinct that screamed at me to turn back. My clients had waited at the entrance, but I'd had to know, had to see. And in the deepest chamber, in darkness so complete it seemed alive, I'd found something. Something that had changed everything I thought I knew about the world. The match burned my fingers, jolting me back to reality. The creature was coiling itself, preparing to spring. Walter had positioned himself between us, but his rifle was empty now, useful only as a club. Time seemed to slow, each heartbeat lasting an eternity. I struck another match, then another, dropping them into the fireplace where small tongues of flame began to lick at the old wood. The creature watched, its form seeming to ripple and distort. Was it larger now? The shadows it cast on the wall certainly were, stretching and twisting into shapes that hurt my eyes to look at. "The sage," Walter shouted. On the mantel, a small bundle of dried sage lay there, wrapped in red thread. I grabbed it, tossing it into the growing flames. The effect was immediate. A sharp, clean smell cut through the creature's foul stench, and it let out a sound that was almost human in its anguish. That sound, I'd heard it before in that cave 5 years ago. The same otherworldly howl that had sent me running in blind panic, leaving behind what? I still couldn't remember exactly what I'd seen that day. My mind had blocked it out, the same way it blocks out trauma too terrible to process. The fire was roaring now, and Walter was backing slowly toward me, his eyes never leaving the creature. "You remember now, don't you?" he asked softly. "Remember what they really are?" I did. My grandmother's stories came flooding back, tales of beings that walked between worlds, that wore darkness like a second skin. The Navajo had many names for them, but one in particular rang in my mind, Naldlushi, Skinwalker. But this was something else, something older. The fire cast wild shadows across its form as it paced before us, and in those shadows I caught glimpses of what it really was. Something that had never been human, had never even been animal, something that had existed in the dark spaces of the world since before there were words to name it. "The adversary," Walter whispered, and the creature's head snapped up at the word, its entire form seeming to vibrate with hatred. The old ones knew. They left warnings if you know where to look. The cave. The memories were coming faster now. The petroglyphs I'd found deep inside, ancient drawings that depicted this exact creature, locked in eternal battle with figures wielding fire. How long had it been here, haunting these lands? How many others had encountered it over the centuries? The fire was at full blaze now, and I could feel its heat on my face. The creature had backed away slightly, but it wasn't retreating. It was gathering itself for one final attack. In its eyes, I saw an intelligence that was utterly alien yet terrifyingly aware. It knew us, knew our kind, had known us for longer than we had known ourselves. Walter pressed something into my hand, a small pouch that smelled of herbs and something metallic. "When it comes," he said, his voice steady despite everything, "throw this into the fire, and whatever happens next, whatever you see, don't look away. You need to remember this time." The creature tensed, its form seeming to grow larger, darker, more terrible with each passing second. As it gathered itself for the final spring, I found myself thinking of all the stories I'd dismissed over the years, all the warnings I'd ignored. The world was older and darker than I'd ever imagined. And here, in this room with this impossible thing, I was about to learn just how deep that darkness went. The adversary launched itself toward us, a mass of shadow and teeth, an ancient, hungry malevolence. I gripped the pouch Walter had given me, knowing that the next few seconds would either kill us or change us forever. Probably both. Time to find out which. Time slowed to a crawl as I hurled the pouch into the flames. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The fire exploded upward, turning from orange to a searing blue-white that burned itself into my retinas. The creature was already airborne, its massive form blotting out everything else in my field of vision. In that moment, suspended between action and consequence, I finally remembered everything about the cave. I'd seen this before. Not just tracks or signs, but the thing itself. It had been waiting in that deepest chamber, coiled around ancient bones and forgotten offerings. I'd dropped my flashlight, but even in the darkness, its eyes had burned like twin stars falling into oblivion. I'd run then, leaving behind more than just my gear. I'd left behind my understanding of what was possible, what was real. Now, there was nowhere to run. The impact knocked both Walter and me backwards as the creature slammed into us with the force of a freight train. Claws raked across my chest, but the pain felt distant, unimportant. The herb-filled pouch had done something to the fire, transformed it into something that felt alive, hungry. Blue-white flames reached out like grasping hands, catching hold of the creature's midnight fur. The sound it made defied description, part scream, part roar, but underlaid with something that reminded me of radio static, of signals from deep space. Its form began to unravel. That's the only word I can think of to describe what happened next. Like a sweater coming undone, but instead of yarn, it was reality itself that was being pulled apart. "Don't look away." Walter's voice seemed to come from very far away. "You need to see what it really is." The creature's outer form burned away like paper in a blast furnace, revealing something underneath that my mind struggled to comprehend. Geometries that shouldn't exist. Patterns that made my eyes water and my temples throb. This was its true form. Something that had put on flesh like a man puts on a coat. Something that had never been meant to walk in our world. The fire reached deeper, and the thing's shape collapsed in on itself, folding into dimensions that shouldn't have been possible. Each movement sent ripples through the air like heat waves off hot asphalt, but these distortions seemed to affect more than just vision. Sound warped and bent, time itself seemed to hiccup and stutter. In those moments of temporal distortion, I saw flashes of other times, other encounters, native warriors with torches, Spanish conquistadors with blessed flame, my own ancestors facing this same creature across centuries. It had always been here, hunting on the edges of our world, taking what it wanted, and we had always fought back, passing down the knowledge of fire and sacred herbs, of how to defeat what could not be killed. The final implosion was almost anticlimactic. One moment the creature was there, a writhing mass of impossible angles and ancient hunger, and the next, it was simply gone. The blue-white flames died down to normal orange, then to embers. The only sound was our ragged breathing and the settling of the old house around us. Walter broke the silence first, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Hell of a job interview, wouldn't you say?" A laugh bubbled up from somewhere deep inside me, slightly hysterical but genuine. "Does this mean I got the position?" He managed a weak smile as he pulled himself to his feet, wincing at what would definitely be impressive bruises tomorrow. "Seems like you've got the necessary experience." The cleanup took hours. Not just the physical debris, the broken furniture, the scattered artifacts, the bloody floorboards, but the metaphysical aftermath as well. Walter showed me how to cleanse the space with sage and cedar, how to lay down protective lines of blessed cornmeal, how to strengthen the barriers between our world and whatever lay beyond. As we worked, he told me more about the creature, the adversary. It wasn't a skinwalker, though it sometimes took similar forms. It was something older, something that had been here before the first people walked these lands. The Navajo had many stories about it, as did the Hopi, the Apache, and others. Each culture had its own name for it, its own rituals for fighting it, but the core truth remained the same. It could be driven back, but never truly destroyed. "It'll be back then?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Walter nodded, laying down another line of cornmeal. "Always does. Might be years, might be decades, but it remembers, and it holds grudges." The sun was rising by the time we finished, painting the desert in shades of gold and rose. Walter's horses had returned to their pastures, grazing peacefully as if nothing had happened. But they stayed in tight groups, always keeping watch. They knew better than most what lurked in the shadows. "So what happens now?" I asked, watching the new day dawn over the ancient land. Walter was quiet for a long moment, studying the horizon. Now you start learning. Really learning. Not just about horses and ranch work, though there'll be plenty of that, but about the old ways, the real ways, about what's really out there and what we can do about it." He turned to face me, his eyes clear and direct. "That's why Loretta sent you to me. She sees things, knows things. Knew you were ready to remember what happened in that cave, ready to face what's really out there. Question is, are you willing to stay, to learn?" I looked out over the ranch at the horses moving like dark shadows across the golden grass, at the red cliffs catching the first full light of morning. I thought about all the years I'd spent running, all the memories I'd tried to bury. Maybe it was time to stop running, time to stand and fight. Yes, I said simply. I'll stay. Walter nodded, satisfied. Good, we'll start tomorrow. For now, let's see about getting some coffee and breakfast. Fighting ancient evils works up an appetite. As we walked back to the house, I could feel the weight of all those ancient stories settling around my shoulders like a familiar blanket. I wasn't just Joshua Treehorn anymore, drifter and failed tour guide. I was part of something older, something that stretched back through generations of watchful guardians who stood against the darkness. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last shadows of night. But we knew better now. Darkness wasn't just the absence of light. It was a living thing, hungry and patient. And somewhere out there, in the spaces between what we know and what we fear, the adversary was waiting, watching, remembering. Let it watch. Let it remember. We would be ready. Years have passed since that first night at the Duncan Ranch. I'm still here, still learning. Walter's getting older now, his hair more white than gray, but his eyes are still sharp as ever. We've had other encounters with things that shouldn't exist. Some worse than others, some that left scars both visible and hidden. But we've survived. We've protected what needed protecting. Sometimes, late at night when the wind howls across the desert like a hungry thing, I think about that cave where it all started. Think about the young man I was, so sure he understood how the world worked. I think about all the others who faced the darkness across the centuries, all the stories passed down in whispers and warnings. I'm a keeper of those stories now, a guardian of ancient knowledge. And sometimes, when travelers stop at the trading post looking for work, looking for a fresh start, I see something in their eyes, a hint of recognition, a ghost of memory, and I think about what Loretta saw in me all those years ago. The darkness is still out there, patient and hungry as ever. But so are we, watching, waiting, ready, and the stories go on. The desert has a way of changing a person. After 5 years working as a ranch hand outside Marfa, Texas, I'd grown accustomed to the vast emptiness, the way the land stretched out endlessly in every direction like an ocean of dust and scrub brush. Name's Russell James Hawkins, though everyone just calls me Rusty, on account of my hair and my tendency to keep old trucks running long past their expiration date. I'd come to Marfa back in '89. Fresh out of a failed marriage in Houston and looking for something, anything, different. The Silver Creek Ranch was hiring, and I figured manual labor might help quiet the thoughts that kept me up at night. Owner was Tom McAllister, a third-generation rancher with calloused hands and eyes that had seen too much sun. He took me on despite my obvious city background, saying he preferred someone willing to learn over someone who thought they knew it all. Those first few years were an education in themselves. I learned the rhythm of ranch life, the pre-dawn starts, the long days mending fences under the merciless Texas sun, the quiet evenings watching stars emerge in a sky so vast it made you feel like a speck of dust. The other hands taught me what I needed to know, how to track strays, predict weather from cloud patterns, and most importantly, how to respect the desert's moods. Marfa wasn't like other towns. Even before the incident, there was something different about it. Artists and tourists would drive through, drawn by stories of the mysterious Marfa lights, those unexplained orbs that danced on the horizon. Local bars buzzed with tales of UFO sightings, of strange creatures glimpsed in the darkness between the stars. I'd laugh along with the other ranch hands, dismissing them as tall tales meant to attract tourists. The old-timers, though, they took these stories seriously. Manuel Ramirez, who'd worked the ranch for 30 years, would cross himself whenever the lights were mentioned. El desierto guarda secretos, he'd say in his quiet way. The desert keeps secrets. I didn't understand then why his voice would drop to a whisper. or why he refused to ride out alone after sunset. There was this unspoken rule among the long-time residents: you didn't mess with certain places after dark. The old windmill out by the Carson property, the abandoned mercury mine 20 miles south, the dried-up creek bed where they'd found those bones back in '73. Bones the county sheriff had quickly and quietly disposed of without filing any reports. That particular night in '94 started like any other. It was late August, and the heat lingered even after sunset, making the air feel thick and oppressive. We'd been having trouble with the perimeter fences. Posts kept coming loose in the sandy soil, and Tom was worried about cattle wandering onto the highway. He'd asked me to do a night check, making sure all the gates were secured. I remember checking my watch around 10 p.m., figuring I had another hour of work ahead of me. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in that peculiar silver light that makes the desert look like another planet. My old Ford pickup rattled along the fence line, headlights catching on strands of barbed wire and clusters of mesquite. The radio was playing softly, some late-night country station out of Alpine, when it started to crackle with static. That should have been my first warning. Radio interference was one of those things the old-timers said to watch out for, like sudden temperature drops or animals going quiet. But I was tired, thinking about the cold beer waiting in my fridge, and I ignored it. It was near the old windmill that I first saw them, two pale points of light hovering just above the ground. At first I figured it was reflections from my headlights catching something metallic, but when I killed the engine they were still there, steady and unnatural in the darkness. The smart thing would have been to radio back to the ranch house. We had a strict protocol about unusual sightings: log it, report it, but don't investigate alone. Those rules existed for a reason, passed down through generations of ranch hands who'd learned the hard way that the desert was unforgiving of foolishness. But something about those lights drew me in. They had a quality I can't quite describe, like looking at a photo that's slightly out of focus, where your brain keeps trying to make sense of what it's seeing but can't quite manage it. I grabbed my rifle from the gun rack, an old .30-30 Winchester that had belonged to my grandfather, and stepped out into the night. The desert air had grown notably colder as I approached the lights, my boots crunching softly on the sandy soil. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if my body was trying to warn me to turn back. The windmill creaked above me, its metal vanes catching moonlight as they turned lazily in the night breeze. That's when I saw the truck, an old pickup, maybe from the '70s, its paint job so faded I couldn't make out the color in the darkness. But it wasn't the truck that made my blood run cold. It was the figure crouched beside it, moving in that terrible, unnatural way that my mind still struggles to comprehend. The figure's movements were wrong, in a way that defied description. Its limbs bent at impossible angles as it dug frantically at the desert floor, throwing sand aside with inhuman strength. In the truck's headlights, I could see long, dark stains down the front of what might have once been a white shirt. The wet gleam of fresh blood. The bundle it pulled from the earth made my heart stop. Wrapped in what looked like old blankets, but I could see pale flesh through the gaps, and dark hair matted with something I didn't want to think about. When it threw the bundle into the truck's cab, I saw her face, eyes wide and staring, throat torn open in a savage gash that nearly separated head from body. When it turned toward me, I saw its eyes. God help me, I'll never forget those eyes. They weren't human, too large, too bright, reflecting the moonlight like a coyote's. But there was intelligence there, and hunger, and something else. Something that knew me, knew everything about me, and wanted to do more than just kill. I fired without thinking, the Winchester's report shattering the desert silence. The creature moved faster than anything I'd ever seen, crossing the distance between us in a heartbeat. I caught a glimpse of teeth, too many teeth, as I turned to run. The trip back to my truck exists in my memory as fragments, snapshots of terror. The sound of feet behind me, not running but skittering like some giant insect. The smell of copper and rot carried on the wind. The way the moonlight seemed to dim as if something was consuming it. I don't remember getting the key in the ignition, but I remember the engine roaring to life. In my rearview mirror, I saw it standing by the windmill. Its shape somehow different now, taller, more angular. Its head cocked at an impossible angle as it watched me flee. I drove straight to the Marfa Sheriff's Station, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. Deputy Sandra Martinez was on duty that night. I knew her. We'd gone to high school together back in Alpine. She listened to my story without interrupting, her face growing increasingly grave. The search party they sent out the next morning found nothing. No blood, no disturbed earth, no signs of struggle. Even the shell casing from my rifle was gone. But they did find something else. Deep scratches in the windmill's metal support beams, spaced wider than any animal could make. Tom McAllister didn't fire me when I refused to do any more night shifts. He'd been around long enough to know that some stories, crazy as they sounded, had truth in them. But things were different after that night. The other hands would fall quiet when I entered the bunkhouse. Conversations would stop mid-sentence. I spent months researching, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The Marfa Public Library had a section of local history books that the tourists never bothered with. In one, published in 1932, I found a photograph that stopped my heart. The same truck I'd seen that night, parked in front of the old Mercury mine. The caption read, "Vehicle abandoned by missing prospector James Harden, 1927. Over the years, I pieced together other incidents. Every decade or so, people would vanish in that part of the desert. Their bodies would sometimes turn up months later, miles from where they disappeared, torn open in ways that made experienced coroners quit their jobs. But never any evidence, never any witnesses. Except me. The woman's face haunted my dreams. I'd wake up sweating, convinced I could hear skittering sounds outside my window. The psychologist in Alpine diagnosed PTSD, prescribed pills that didn't help. How could they? Pills can't erase the knowledge that the world isn't what we think it is, that something walks in the desert darkness that should not exist. I tried to warn people. Posted on message boards, reached out to investigators. Most thought I was crazy. Some wanted to turn my story into a book or movie, missing the point entirely. This wasn't entertainment. It was a warning. It's been 30 years since that night, and I'm still here in Marfa. Can't leave, though. I've tried. Something about that encounter changed me, marked me in a way I can't explain. The desert keeps its secrets, but sometimes it shares them with you, whether you want them or not. The lights still appear sometimes, out by the old windmill. I've learned to look away, to drive past without slowing. But on quiet nights, when the moon is full and the wind carries the smell of creosote and sage, I think about what's out there. What's always been out there, waiting in the spaces between towns, between thoughts, between what we know and what we fear. Last week, a tourist couple disappeared somewhere out past the Carson property. The police found their rental car, doors open, picnic lunch still spread out on the hood. No signs of violence, no tracks leading away. Just emptiness, and in the soft desert soil, a single mark. Like something heavy had been dragged, or had dragged itself toward the old windmill. I should tell them what I know. Should warn them about what hunts in the darkness. But who would believe me? And more importantly, what good would it do? Some things can't be stopped, can't be fought. Some things are as much a part of this land as the dust and the stars, and the endless, empty horizon. So I keep my silence, and I stay away from the desert at night. And if you're ever driving through Marfa, through any of these lonely places where the radio stations fade to static and the stars seem too bright and too close, don't stop. Don't look too long into the darkness. And whatever you do, don't investigate strange lights in the distance. Because sometimes the desert doesn't just keep secrets. Sometimes it hungers for them. After 3 days, the hospital couldn't justify keeping me any longer. My wound was healing clean, no sign of infection. The mental scars were another story. I couldn't sleep more than an hour at a time without jerking awake, convinced I could smell that musty bar air, hear the scrape of claws on wooden floors. I sold my vacuum samples for cheap to another traveling salesman and used the money to rent a small room above the town's only diner. I told myself it was just until I got my strength back, but deep down I knew I was scared to leave. Something about that night felt unfinished, like a story missing its final chapter. During the day, I'd sit in the diner, drinking coffee gone cold and poring over Jim's collection of newspaper clippings. The pattern was there, but it didn't make sense. The killings weren't regular. Sometimes months would pass between incidents, sometimes just days. The victims seemed random. No connection except bad luck and worse timing. But there was something else, something that nagged at the edges of my mind, like a half-remembered dream. That moment before the creature fled, when it had screamed in pain.
What had hurt it?
The bartender hadn't done anything, and my pathetic attempt with the bar stool had barely slowed it down. I started asking questions around town, careful-like, trying not to sound as obsessed as I felt. Most folks clammed up tight at the mention of the Crow murders, but the old-timers, especially after a few drinks, they'd talk. They had stories passed down from their grandparents, tales of something that walked like a man but wasn't. Something that fed on fear as much as flesh. Native American legends spoke of a creature called the Skinwalker, a being that could take human form but was betrayed by its eyes like pools of oil. They said it could be hurt by certain sacred objects or by people with pure hearts and strong spirits. I wasn't sure about the pure heart part, but something had hurt that thing in the bar. 6 weeks after the attack, I finally worked up the courage to go back to the Rusty Spur. The place was closed now. Wooden boards nailed across the windows, a for sale sign hanging crooked on the door. Jim had moved on, headed east to stay with family in Oklahoma. Can't say I blamed him. I stood there in the fading daylight, staring at those boarded-up windows when something caught my eye. Scratched into one of the boards, fresh enough that the wood still looked pale. "Watching you, Doug." My blood ran cold. It knew my name. Had it known who I was that night in the bar? Had I just been in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or was there something more to it? I turned to hurry back to my room above the diner, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing at the end of the street, tall and dark against the setting sun. A fedora perched on its head. I ran. Didn't even try to play it cool, just turned and sprinted like the devil himself was on my heels. Maybe he was. I made it back to my room, slammed the door and pushed a dresser in front of it. As my heart hammered in my chest, I realized something that made my skin crawl. I wasn't just a witness anymore. I was being hunted. That night, as I sat in my room with every light burning and a kitchen knife clutched in my trembling hand, I made a decision. I couldn't just keep running, couldn't just wait for it to find me. I needed answers, and to get them, I'd have to start at the beginning. Flagstaff, Arizona, where the first murders had happened. What I didn't know then was that my decision would lead me down a path darker than any nightmare, into a mystery that had been unfolding for generations. The Crow wasn't just a serial killer or a monster from Native American legend. It was something older, something that had been waiting for someone like me, someone who had seen its true face and lived to tell about it. The drive to Flagstaff took 2 days in my beat-up Chevy. Every mile marker brought me closer to answers I wasn't sure I wanted. The mountains rose up around me, a stark change from Nevada's desert, and with the altitude came a creeping cold that seemed to seep into my bones, right into that scarred shoulder. I found the house easily enough. Everyone in town knew about the Miller murders, even 5 years later. The place stood empty, paint peeling, yard overgrown. Local kids called it the Crow House now, daring each other to spend nights inside, if they only knew. The library's microfilm archives filled in the gaps Jim's clippings had missed. The Millers weren't the first victims, just the first time the Crow had signed its work. Before that, similar killings stretched back decades. Always the same pattern. Families or loners torn apart in the night, no signs of forced entry. But it was at a local bar that I found my first real lead. An old man, skin like tanned leather, nursing a whiskey at 2 in the afternoon. He'd been a tribal police officer back in '54 when the Millers died. He recognized something in me, that haunted look of someone who'd seen too much. "The old ones," he said, voice rough as gravel. "They knew about it. Called it different names, but always the same story. A thing that feeds on fear, that can wear human skin like a coat. But it's got rules, see? Can't enter unless invited. Can't kill unless you show fear." "What happens if you don't show fear?" I asked. He smiled, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "Nobody knows. Nobody's ever managed it." I spent 3 months in Flagstaff, tracking down leads, piecing together the puzzle. The creature had been active in cycles, killing sprees followed by long periods of quiet. But why, and why had it broken pattern to follow me? The answer came from an unexpected source. A professor at the local college, specialist in Native American folklore. She'd been collecting stories like mine for years, building a theory. "It's not just killing for food or sport," she explained, spreading papers across her desk. "It's searching for something, or someone. The legends say these creatures were once human shamans who made dark bargains for power. But the transformation isn't complete until they find a worthy successor. Someone who can look into their true eyes and not break." The summer of 1959 found me sweating through my best suit in a dusty Nevada town that time seemed to have forgotten. My name's Doug Carter, and back then I was just another door-to-door vacuum salesman trying to make ends meet. The irony wasn't lost on me. Selling cleaning equipment in a place where dust was about the only thing in abundance. The town was barely a speck on the map, the kind of place where even tumbleweeds looked overdressed. As the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, I found myself drawn to the only sign of life, a weathered bar called the Rusty Spur, its neon sign flickering weakly against the desert sky. The name made my teeth ache with its try-hard Western charm, but beggars can't be choosers. Besides, I figured the bartender might know which doors in town were worth knocking on. The bar's interior hit me with a wall of stale beer and something else. Something musky and old. Behind the bar, a beefy man in a stained apron methodically polished a glass, not bothering to look up as I settled onto a creaking bar stool. "Can I help you?" He grunted, his eyes fixed on his task. "Beer, please. And say, you wouldn't happen to know anyone in town needing a top-of-the-line vacuum." He set down a foamy glass with a thud. "Nope, town's quiet. Most folks here, they still use brooms." I nursed my beer, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in my stomach. The day's sales sheet was as empty as the bar, and my commission check was looking mighty thin. As I contemplated one last desperate round of door-knocking, a rustle from the back of the bar caught my attention, something moving in the shadows of a darkened booth. The bartender's voice cut through my thoughts. "You might want to get a move on." He jerked his thumb toward the window where storm clouds had gathered, painting the sky an ominous purple. "Weather can turn nasty out here real quick." Before I could respond, the bar door swung open with a gust of cold wind that carried the sharp scent of rain and sand. A figure stepped inside, dripping wet and hulking in a dark overcoat, a fedora pulled low over his face. The bartender gave him a curt nod as the stranger made his way to the back of the bar, toward those same darkened booths where I'd heard movement earlier. Something about him set off alarm bells in my head. The way he moved, maybe. Or just that prickling sensation on the back of my neck that tells you when something's not right. I was reaching for my wallet to settle up when a scream split the air, high-pitched and desperate, the kind of sound that haunts your dreams. The bartender's glass shattered on the floor. "What the hell?" he shouted, already moving toward the back room. Against every survival instinct I possessed, I followed. What we found in that back room would change my life forever. A young waitress lay crumpled on the floor, her blonde hair matted with blood, her uniform torn. Her eyes, wide with terror, seemed to stare right through me. And there, looming in the shadows, stood the man in the fedora, clutching something dark and gleaming. The bartender retched. The stranger whirled around, and I saw his eyes, not human eyes at all, but pools of oily blackness. He moved with impossible speed, lunging for the bartender. I didn't think, just acted, swinging a broken bar stool with all my might. The impact bought us precious seconds, but the creature... I couldn't think of him as a man anymore, just smiled like this was all some twisted game. The next moments were a blur of pain and violence. My shoulder erupted in agony, and I found myself trapped against the wall, staring at a curved talon dripping with my own blood. Just when I thought it was over, something extraordinary happened. The creature screamed, not in triumph but in pain. Steam rose from its face where it clutched at itself, and with another inhuman howl, it crashed through the back door into the storm. The aftermath was a haze of pain and confusion. The bartender's babbling revealed fragments of a darker truth. Stories of a drifter, a devil really, who'd been leaving a trail of bodies across the desert for years. And there, scrawled in blood on the floorboards, was a single word: Crow. I got the bartender to drive us to the nearest hospital, where they patched up my shoulder as best they could. The cops came, asked their questions, but I could tell they were just going through the motions. They'd seen this before or something like it, and knew they wouldn't catch him. Years have passed since that night at the Rusty Spur. My shoulder never quite healed right, a constant reminder of the evil I encountered. I quit selling vacuums, drifted from job to job, always careful to avoid small-town bars with clever names, no matter how thirsty I got. Some nights, when the wind howls just right and my old wound aches, I swear I can hear that name, Crow, whispered on the breeze. Maybe it was just some psychopath with a flair for the dramatic, but deep down I know better. The monsters in our stories have to come from somewhere after all, and sometimes they wear fedoras and walk among us, just waiting for the right moment to strike. Recovery wasn't just about the physical wounds. The doctors did what they could for my shoulder, cleaned it, stitched it up, wrapped it in pristine white bandages that would eventually stain yellow with seeping plasma. But they couldn't fix the way my hands shook when I tried to hold a coffee cup, or how every shadow in my peripheral vision seemed to move like a man in a fedora. The local police were worse than useless. They took statements, snapped photos of the crime scene, and filed reports that would gather dust in some basement archive. But I could see it in their eyes. They'd seen this before. The bartender, Jim Murphy was his name, confirmed my suspicions during one of his visits to my hospital room. Been happening for years, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Started down in Arizona near Flagstaff. Family of 4 found torn apart in their home. Only thing left was that word, Crow, written on the wall. Jim had been collecting newspaper clippings, creating a twisted timeline of bloody breadcrumbs across the Southwest. A waitress in New Mexico, a gas station attendant in Texas, a traveling salesman in Utah, all with the same signature, all with witnesses describing a man in a dark coat and fedora. All with those horrible black eyes. That's when it hit me, the bar. When it had me cornered, I'd looked right into those black eyes. And though I'd been terrified, I hadn't looked away. I wasn't just a witness or a victim. I was a candidate. It found me that night, of course. I'd known it would. The knock came just after midnight, 3 sharp raps that seemed to shake the whole motel room. "Come in," I called, surprising myself with how steady my voice was. "I've been expecting you." The door swung open and there it stood. The dark coat, the fedora, those eyes like pools of endless night. But this time I didn't run. This time I was ready. "You're a hard man to wait for, Doug Carter," it said, voice like rustling dead leaves. Most would have broken by now. Most would have given in to the fear. "Sorry to disappoint," I replied, standing my ground. "But I've learned a few things since we last met." Its smile was all wrong, too wide, too many teeth. "Have you learned enough?" The next few minutes were a blur of motion and violence. It was faster than me, stronger than me, but I had one advantage. I understood now. Fear wasn't just its weapon. It was its weakness. Every time it struck, I forced myself to stand firm, to face it without flinching. And slowly, something began to change. Its movements became less sure, its form less solid. Those black eyes started to show something I'd never expected to see: uncertainty. I pulled out what the professor had given me, a small pouch of blessed herbs and earth from sacred ground. The creature hissed at the sight of it. "You can't kill me," it snarled. "I've existed for centuries." "Maybe not," I agreed. "But I can refuse you. I can deny you what you need." I opened the pouch and began the chant she'd taught me, ancient words in a language I didn't understand. The creature screamed, its form rippling like heat waves off hot asphalt. "You could have had power," it spat. "Could have become like me." "I've seen what you are," I replied, "and I choose to remain human." The ritual ended with a flash of light and a sound like thunder. When my vision cleared, I was alone in the room. On the wall, written in what looked like ash, "Another time, another choice." That was 20 years ago. I never saw the creature again, not directly. But sometimes in small towns across the Southwest I hear stories. Stories about a man in a dark coat and fedora, about black eyes and bloody signatures. I still travel those desert roads, but not selling vacuums anymore. Instead, I look for others like me. People who've seen something they can't explain, who carry that haunted look. I tell them what I know, teach them the rituals I've learned. The professor says I've become something of a legend myself, the man who refused the crow's gift. Maybe that's true, but mostly, I'm just trying to help others make the same choice I did. Because the real horror isn't the monsters that lurk in the darkness. It's how easily we might become them. Some nights, when the wind howls and my shoulder aches, I wonder if I made the right choice. Then I remember those black eyes, that hungry smile, and I know I did. There are some gifts that come with too high a price. They say the crow still walks the desert highways, still seeks its successor. So if you're ever in a small town bar and a man in a fedora sits down beside you, remember my story. Remember that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply remain human. The midnight call of the Alaskan wilderness is not something that can be easily ignored, especially when it wraps its frigid fingers around your very soul. My name is Ahanu Black Wolf, and I never believed I would end up here, isolated in the vastness of Denali National Park. The name Ahanu means "he laughs" in my ancestors' Algonquin tongue, a cruel irony considering I haven't genuinely laughed in months. Before the solitude of ranger life, I was drowning in Seattle, buried under mounting student loans, a failed marriage, and a marketing career that felt as authentic as the heavily filtered photos I created for soulless corporations. The day my ex-wife Sarah announced she was moving to Boston with her new boyfriend, something inside me snapped, not in anger but in a strange, liberating surrender. My Blackfoot grandmother always told me that my spirit belonged to the land, not to concrete and glass. I sold nearly everything I owned, packed my remaining possessions into my weathered Toyota 4Runner, and applied for seasonal ranger positions across the country. When the Denali offer arrived, I accepted without hesitation. The pay was meager, barely enough to make minimum payments on my debts, but it came with housing, a small, sturdy cabin near Wonder Lake, roughly 85 miles into the park. Remote even by Alaskan standards. The cabin had seen better days. Built in the 1950s, it featured a single bedroom, a modest kitchen living area, and a bathroom with temperamental plumbing. The previous ranger had left behind a stack of journals, detailed maps marked with strange symbols, and a collection of local indigenous artifacts. Items I should have immediately turned over to park headquarters, but selfishly kept to study. I loved the silence most of all. After years of city noise, the profound quiet felt like a physical presence, one that held me accountable to my thoughts. The isolation was supposed to heal me, to give me space to rebuild. Instead, it opened something else entirely. My duties were straightforward: monitor wildlife patterns, assist lost hikers, enforce park regulations, and submit weekly reports. Simple work that allowed me to fade into the landscape. 3 months in, I had settled into a comfortable routine. Then the nightmares began. They always started the same way. I'm walking along a game trail I've never seen before, though somehow I know exactly where I am. The forest grows unnaturally still. No birds, no insects, no wind disturbing the leaves. Ahead, something walks on 2 legs, but moves with a broken, unnatural gait. It never fully turns around, but I can see enough to know it wears the imperfect skin of something once human. I would wake gasping, my cabin walls seeming to pulse with the rhythm of my heartbeat. Outside, only darkness and the occasional call of a night bird. The first incident happened in late June. A family of 4 had ventured off trail and hadn't returned to their campsite. Standard procedure was to organize a search party, but storms were rolling in, and I was the closest ranger. I set out alone with my emergency pack, radio, and GPS. I found them huddled beneath a rocky outcropping, the parents trying desperately to comfort their terrified children. The mother grabbed my arm with surprising strength when I approached. "Something's been following us," she whispered, her eyes wild. "It looks like a man, but it's not right." I assumed wildlife, perhaps a bear walking upright momentarily or a moose glimpsed in poor light. The father shook his head when I suggested this. "It called our names," he said flatly. "It called out using my wife's voice." I got them back to their vehicle safely, though the entire hike out, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. The forest seemed to bend inward, listening to our every footfall. When I filed my report, I omitted their claims. Stress and fear can create powerful hallucinations in the wilderness. I knew this. But that night, sitting alone in my cabin, I pulled out one of the previous ranger's journals and found a similar account from 3 years prior. The entry ended with a simple warning: the skinwalkers are returning. They remember the old boundaries and do not care. I closed the journal and locked it in my desk drawer, telling myself these were just old superstitions. I was a man of science, not folklore. But as I drifted off to sleep, the wind seemed to whisper words just beyond my comprehension. And in the darkness behind my eyelids, something watched and waited. Growing up on the reservation in Montana, I'd heard the elders speak of dangerous things in hushed tones. My grandmother would never use their proper names, Skinwalker or Yeenaldlushi, as the Navajo called them, claiming that naming them was invitation. "Some things live in the corners of existence," she'd tell me, "and should remain there." As a modern, college-educated man, I'd dismiss those stories as cultural metaphors, ways to explain the unexplainable and instill caution in children. Now, alone in the Alaskan wilderness with unexplained occurrences mounting, those childhood warnings echoed with new gravity. July brought record heat to Denali. The permafrost softened, streams swelled with meltwater, and wildlife behaved erratically. Moose abandoned their usual feeding grounds. Wolf packs went silent. Even the ravens, usually bold camp scavengers, disappeared from the area around my cabin. I began finding strange tracks in the mud near my water pump. Not quite human, not quite animal, as if someone had crafted crude 5-toed shoes to mimic wildlife prints. I photographed them, measured them, and pored over tracking guides, but found nothing comparable. When I returned the next morning to make plaster casts, the ground was churned beyond recognition. The isolation was getting to me. I started talking to myself, first in mutters, then in full conversations. I'd catch myself standing at the window for hours watching the tree line. My sleep fractured into brittle segments, each interrupted by sounds that vanished when I fully woke. My financial troubles seemed increasingly irrelevant. The student loan notices piled up unopened on my small desk. What did it matter if my credit was ruined? Out here, the economy was meat and warmth and distance from things that moved in unnatural ways. During my weekly supply run to the small ranger station 40 miles east, I casually mentioned the unusual tracks to Gerald, a veteran ranger nearing retirement. His weathered face tightened, eyes narrowing. "Where exactly is your cabin again?" he asked, though he certainly knew. When I told him, he nodded slowly. "That area has history. Before it was parkland, there was an incident in '73 with a trapper who, well, he did things people shouldn't do. Claimed something was hunting him, so he started hunting it back. Used methods no decent hunter would touch." "What happened to him?" I asked. Gerald looked away. "Official report says he froze to death. Body was found inside out, though. Skin removed in one piece, turned reverse, with him stuffed back in." He cleared his throat. "Of course, that's just the story. Records say animal attack, exposure." He insisted I take his satellite phone as a backup to my Ranger radio. "Cell service is spotty enough in the good areas," he said. "Where you are, it's non-existent." That night, driving back, my headlights caught something standing by the narrow road, a tall, emaciated figure that might have been human if not for the unnatural length of its limbs and the way its head tilted at an impossible angle. By the time I braked and reversed, nothing remained but disturbed brush and that same pervasive silence. In my cabin, I pulled out the journals again. The previous ranger, a man named Thomas Mills, had meticulously documented his own descent into paranoia. His early entries were professional, detailing weather patterns and wildlife sightings. By the end, the handwriting had deteriorated, pages filled with the same phrases repeated hundreds of times. "It wears familiar faces. Learns by watching. It wants inside." The final entry, dated 3 days before he was evacuated for psychological evaluation, contained a crude map with my cabin circled in red ink. Around it, written in what appeared to be dried blood, "Threshold weakening." That night I dreamed of my grandmother. We sat by a fire as she explained what I was facing wasn't a creature, but a hunger, an ancient consciousness that wore bodies like clothing, discarding them when they wore thin. "They were here before us," she said, "and they resent what was taken." I woke to scratching at my door, not the frantic clawing of an animal, but deliberate, almost thoughtful. 3 slow drags, pause, 3 again. A pattern. Communication. When I finally gathered the courage to look outside at dawn, I found a perfect impression in the dirt. A handprint, palm up, fingers abnormally long, pressed so deeply that water had pooled in its center. An invitation, or a warning. August brought a suffocating blanket of wildfire smoke from distant blazes in Canada. The sun shone blood-red through the haze, casting an apocalyptic glow over the landscape. The air tasted of ash and something else, a metallic undertone that coated my tongue and lingered in the back of my throat. Rangers were working overtime, helping with fire monitoring and evacuation preparations. Though my sector remained relatively safe, my weekly check-ins became less frequent as resources stretched thin. The isolation deepened like the growing shadows around my cabin. I'd begun keeping a journal of my own, partly to maintain sanity and partly to document the escalating strangeness. The battery on my satellite phone inexplicably drained despite minimal use. My radio worked, but increasingly picked up bizarre interference. Fragments of conversations I couldn't possibly be hearing. Voices speaking languages I didn't recognize, and sometimes, worst of all, what sounded like my own voice repeating words I had yet to speak. Hikers reported disorientation even on well-marked trails. Compasses spinning uselessly, GPS devices showing impossible locations. 3 separate groups described encountering a tall, gaunt ranger who directed them deeper into unmarked territory before disappearing. They all gave the same description. They all thought it was me. I hadn't left my patrol zone in weeks. One evening while chopping firewood, a meditative activity that briefly quieted my racing thoughts, I noticed movement at the tree line. A large animal, I assumed perhaps a moose or bear. I set down my axe and reached for my binoculars. What I saw froze my blood. A figure crouched at the forest edge, its proportions almost human but distorted. Limbs too long, joints articulating in impossible directions. It wore what looked like tattered ranger clothing, the green-gray uniform I recognized as our summer issue. When it sensed my attention, it stood with a jerking motion and turned. Its face was wrong. Features technically human but assembled incorrectly, as if someone had described a face to a being that had never seen one. The eyes were the worst part, utterly black, reflecting nothing, absorbing everything. It raised a hand in perfect mimicry of a friendly wave, the gesture so normal it somehow amplified the wrongness of everything else. Then, with movements like stop-motion animation, it retreated into the trees. That night I barricaded my door and windows, though some deeper instinct told me such barriers meant nothing to what stalked outside. I tried calling headquarters but got only static punctuated by what sounded like chewing noises. The satellite phone displayed no service despite clear skies. Sleep came in microsecond bursts, each waking moment marked by sounds, footsteps circling my cabin, the scrape of something hard against wood siding, and voices, so many voices. They called my name in the tones of people I knew, my ex-wife, my grandmother, former colleagues, even Gerald from the station. Each voice pleaded for entry, claimed to be freezing, injured, lost. I covered my ears and rocked back and forth, reciting the scientific names of Alaskan flora to ground myself in rationality. Somewhere around dawn, I must have truly fallen asleep because I dreamed again of my grandmother. This time, she didn't speak. She simply handed me one of her intricate beaded medicine bags and gestured toward the symbols woven into its design. When I looked up to ask their meaning, her face began to stretch and distort, skin pulling back to reveal something ancient and hungry beneath. I woke screaming, drenched in sweat despite the morning chill. On my kitchen table sat an object that hadn't been there before. A small pouch of weathered leather, symbols burned into its surface, identical to the one from my dream. Inside, I found a mixture of herbs, soil, and what appeared to be dried blood. My door remained locked, my barricades undisturbed. That morning I received an unexpected radio call. A group of university researchers had lost contact with 2 team members near my sector. As the closest ranger, I was tasked with finding them. The thought of venturing out filled me with dread, but I couldn't refuse without raising questions about my mental state. Packed emergency supplies, secured my cabin as best I could, and hesitantly placed the mysterious medicine bag in my pocket. Whatever its origin, I felt a strange reassurance from its weight against my thigh. The researchers' last known location was approximately 7 miles northeast, in an area locals historically avoided, a section of forest denser than its surroundings, where sunlight seemed reluctant to penetrate even on bright days. I knew it well, having skirted its boundaries during previous patrols, always finding reasons not to enter too deeply. Today, I had no choice. As I approached its perimeter, wildlife sounds ceased abruptly. The smoke-filtered light dimmed further, though the canopy was no thicker than elsewhere. The air grew heavy, resistant, as if the atmosphere itself thickened with each step. Something watched me, not from any specific direction, but from everywhere at once. I felt exposed, translucent, as if whatever observed could see through skin to bone, through bone to soul. "Help!" A voice shattered the silence, a woman's voice, desperate and afraid, coming from deeper within the forest darkness. One of the researchers, surely. I hesitated only briefly before plunging forward, my training temporarily overriding my fear. The voice called again, urging me onward, but something wasn't right. It came from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, impossible to triangulate. Then I heard it. My name in my own voice, breathed inches from my ear though I stood alone in the forest. Ahanu, you've finally come to join us. The missing researchers' campsite looked as though it had been abandoned mid-meal. A pot of water still hung over the ashes of their fire pit. 2 tents stood partially erected, sleeping bags unrolled inside. Field notebooks lay open, the last entries describing unusual animal behavior and acoustic anomalies in the forest. I called out repeatedly, my voice swallowed by the unnatural density of the woods. No echo returned. No birds startled from branches. I took photographs of the scene, noting the lack of struggle or signs of wildlife interference. This wasn't a bear encounter or wolf attack. Everything simply looked paused. As I examined the larger tent, I found a voice recorder, still running, battery nearly depleted. I rewound it slightly and pressed play. Static crackled, then a woman's voice. Day 3 of acoustic monitoring. We're still getting those infrasound readings, well below normal hearing range, but somehow perceptible as a kind of pressure. Dr. Lansing thinks it might explain the legends about this area, that the indigenous peoples were sensing these sound waves without hearing them, interpreting them as spiritual phenomena. Background noise, rustling papers, someone humming tunelessly. Wait, did you see that? By the tree line. A man's voice now tense. See what? The woman again. I thought I saw someone watching us. Tall figure. Maybe a ranger? Silence for several seconds. Hello? The man called out. Park Service? More silence, then suddenly, unmistakably, my own voice answered from the recording. Yes, I'm Ranger Black Wolf. You shouldn't be here. The recording continued with their conversation with whatever was using my identity. It gave them directions to a safer camping location deeper in the forest, away from dangerous wildlife activity. They packed quickly, the recorder still running in a pocket, capturing their breathing and footsteps. The final minutes contained only walking sounds, then whispered arguments as they realized they were being led in circles. The man's voice rose in panic. That's not, look at its legs. Oh God, that's not a person. The woman screamed. The recorder captured a wet, tearing sound, then heavy breathing, not human breathing, but something labored and rhythmic like machinery. Then, in my voice again, perfectly inflected, but emotionless. I am Ranger Ahanu Black Wolf. I'll keep you safe. The recording ended. I stood frozen, the recorder still in my trembling hand. My own voice speaking words I never said. My name and title used as bait. Night was approaching, the dim forest growing dimmer. I needed to report this, to get back to my radio. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A scrap of green fabric snagged on a low branch. Park Service uniform material. I approached cautiously. The fabric was weathered but relatively recent. Beside it, partially hidden by undergrowth, lay a leather wallet. I flipped it open to find a Park Service ID for Thomas Mills, the previous ranger, the journal writer, the man who had supposedly been evacuated for psychological evaluation 2 years ago. The ID photo showed a bearded man in his 40s, unremarkable except for the intensity of his eyes. Behind the ID was a folded note in cramped handwriting. If you're reading this, you're the new offering. They've been feeding us to it for decades, one ranger at a time. The isolation isn't a bug, it's a feature. We're easier to replace this way. They'll say I had a breakdown. They'll say the same about you when it's your turn. The boundaries are weakening. It's hungry for more than just rangers now. Cold sweat ran down my spine. The medicine bag in my pocket seemed to grow warm against my leg. I had to get out, had to warn someone. I turned to retrace my steps and found myself facing an unfamiliar landscape. The forest had shifted, rearranged itself while my attention was elsewhere. Disoriented, I checked my compass. The needle spun uselessly, rotating in complete circles. My GPS device showed coordinates that placed me in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The sun, barely visible through smoke and canopy, offered no directional help as it faded. Panic threatened to overwhelm me. I forced myself to breathe, to think. If I couldn't navigate out, I'd need to shelter in place until daylight. The researchers' abandoned campsite seemed the safest option, though safe had become a dangerously relative term. As I settled in for the night, barricaded inside the larger tent with my flashlight and satellite phone still showing no service, I removed the medicine bag from my pocket. The symbols burned into its leather seemed to catch the light oddly, almost glowing from within. I recognized elements of Blackfoot design, but others were unfamiliar, older perhaps, or from traditions my grandmother had never shared. Whatever presence watched from the forest darkness seemed held at bay by the tent's thin walls, though logic told me such protection was imaginary at best. Still nothing approached. No sounds disturbed the night except my own breathing, until I wasn't alone in breathing anymore. Something moved outside the tent, not with footsteps, but with a sliding, dragging motion. Around and around it went, circling. Occasionally it paused near the zippered entrance, and I could hear it sniffing, the wet sounds of nostrils dilating. Ahanu. My name in my ex-wife's voice. Please let me in. I'm sorry for everything. I came to find you. Then in Gerald's gruff tones, Ranger Blackwolf, emergency situation. Need your assistance immediately. Then my grandmother's voice, speaking in her native Blackfoot. Grandson, the bag I gave you will only work if you share it willingly. You must invite me in. My fingers clutched the medicine pouch so tightly the leather cut into my palm. Blood welled around my clenched fingers, soaking into the bag. The symbols darkened, absorbing the offering. Outside, the voices grew frantic, overlapping, discordant. A cacophony of familiar and strange tones, all demanding entry, all claiming to be real, to be human, to be freezing or injured or lost. Then silence fell so abruptly, it felt like a physical pressure against my eardrums. A new voice spoke, not mimicking anyone I knew, but ancient, multi-layered, as if many throats shared one speech. We remember when your kind feared the dark properly. Skinwalker. The term hit me like a physical blow. Skinwalker. What the Navajo called those who practiced the darkest magic, who could take animal forms, who violated taboos to gain power. But the voice had called me this name. You wear your skin so proudly, the voice continued, so certain it belongs to you alone. Your people have forgotten the borrowing, the wearing, the returning. The tent walls bulged inward as something massive pressed against them from all sides simultaneously. The fabric stretched but didn't tear. The medicine bag in my bleeding hand grew hot as coal. We hunger, the voice said simply, and you have been given to us. Dawn seemed impossibly far away. Morning arrived with disorienting suddenness, as if night had been artificially terminated rather than naturally concluded. I emerged from the tent to find the forest transformed, not by any physical change, but by an absence. The weight of being watched had temporarily lifted. My hand throbbed where the medicine bag's leather had cut into my palm. The dried blood formed a perfect outline of the symbols, now etched into my skin like a brand. The bag itself had deteriorated to dust. I gathered my equipment with shaking hands and attempted to navigate out using the sun's position. Whether by luck or something else's design, I found a game trail that seemed to lead toward more open terrain. As the trees thinned, my radio crackled to life, Gerald's voice requesting a status update on the missing researchers. I hesitated before responding. How could I explain what I'd found? What I'd experienced? I settled for facts without interpretation. Campsite located. Researchers missing. Signs of hasty departure but no obvious struggle. Found recording device with unusual content. Requesting additional search support. After a pause that stretched too long, Gerald responded, Copy that. Stay at the campsite. Team en route. Negative, I replied immediately. Location feels unsafe. Proceeding to ranger cabin to gather additional supplies. Another long pause. That's inadvisable, Black Wolf. Protocol is to remain at the scene. Something in his tone sent warning signals through my body. The formality, the insistence, it felt wrong, mechanical. I made a split-second decision. Signal breaking up, returning to... I cut myself off mid-sentence and switched off the radio. My instincts screamed danger, though from what direction I couldn't determine. I neither returned to the campsite nor headed directly to my cabin. Instead, I moved perpendicular to both, seeking higher ground where I might assess the situation more clearly. After an hour's careful hiking, I reached a rocky outcropping that offered views across the valley. In the distance, I could see my cabin and the 3 Park Service vehicles parked outside it. Figures in ranger uniforms moved with precise, identical gaits, searching the perimeter in widening circles. None had been dispatched when I called in. None should have arrived so quickly. I raised my binoculars. The ranger's movement seemed choreographed, too fluid yet simultaneously too rigid. When one turned toward my position, I caught a glimpse of its face, or rather the approximation of a face, features sliding slightly out of position when not directly observed. A horrible understanding dawned. Whatever stalked these woods had expanded its territory and capabilities. It wasn't just imitating me anymore. The infection or infiltration had spread. Needed allies, information, weapons, but couldn't risk approaching any official channels. If the entity had compromised the ranger service, who else might be under its influence? Miles to the east lay the small Athabascan community of Nikolai. I'd met several elders during cultural resource monitoring trips. If anyone might understand what I faced, it would be them. The journey took 2 days of careful travel, avoiding trails and ranger outposts. I slept in trees, tied to branches with climbing rope. Each night, voices called from below, colleagues, family, my own voice offering comfort and safety if I'd just come down. Each morning, I found strange tracks circling my chosen shelter. The marks on my palm neither healed nor infected, maintaining a perfect, painless pattern that seemed to shimmer in certain lights. Twice I encountered wildlife, a fox and later a moose, that stopped to stare at me with unnaturally focused attention before fleeing in apparent terror. When I finally reached Nikolai, exhausted and ravenous, I sought out Elder Shanodithit, a respected medicine woman who had always been kind to Park Service workers. Her small cabin sat at the village edge, surrounded by carved wooden figures facing outward like sentinels. When she opened the door to my knock, her weathered face showed no surprise, only grim confirmation. "You've been marked," she said, gesturing to my hand. "Come inside, quickly." Her home smelled of herbs, smoke, and something sharper, ceremonial elements I recognized from childhood visits to Blackfoot spiritual leaders. She examined the symbols on my palm without touching them, nodding occasionally. "Your grandmother gave you protection," she finally said. "Old magic, strong boundaries." "My grandmother died 10 years ago," I responded. "The medicine bag appeared in my cabin while I was sleeping." Shanodithit's eyes widened fractionally. "Then she watches from beyond. Good. You'll need all possible allies." She moved to a shelf crowded with jars and boxes. "What you face has many names in many traditions. My people call it Nakani, the bushman, the taker of skins. Others call it Wendigo, skinwalker, fleshgate." "What does it want?" I asked. "To wear us," she said simply. "To be us. It hungers for form and identity, for the solidity of flesh and the complexity of human thought." She selected various dried elements, grinding them together in a stone mortar. "It has always been here, but contained, bounded. Something has weakened those boundaries." "The previous ranger's journal mentioned a trapper in the 70s, I offered. "Someone who did things people shouldn't do." She nodded grimly. "Nathan Holloway used forbidden methods to trap animals, pain snares, poison baits. Started hunting larger game, then people. Claimed he was protecting himself from something hunting him." She shook her head. "He invited it in, gave it form and purpose. How do I stop it?" "You don't," she said flatly. "Not alone. Such entities can be bound, contained, but rarely destroyed. They are as much idea as flesh, as much hunger as form. She mixed her ground ingredients with water in a small bowl, then dipped her finger in the paste and traced additional symbols onto my forearm, connecting to the patterns on my palm. "Your blood has already accepted the boundary," she explained. "These will strengthen it, prevent it from wearing your skin or fully mimicking your voice. But others remain vulnerable." "The researchers," I said quietly. "The other rangers." "If they still exist as themselves," she acknowledged. "Many may already be taken, their skins worn by fragments of the greater hunger." A plan formed in my mind, dangerous, possibly suicidal, but necessary. "I need to go back," I told her. "To the center of its territory, to the researchers' camp." "You would face it directly?" She sounded more curious than alarmed. "Someone has to contain it before it spreads further. The boundaries need to be restored." She studied me for a long moment before nodding. "Then you will need stronger protection and knowledge." From beneath her bed, she retrieved a wooden box with familiar symbols carved into its surface. "Your grandmother and I corresponded for many years. She sent me this, said it belonged to your bloodline, but was safer far from your family lands." Inside lay an ancient obsidian knife, its handle wrapped in leather darkened by years of ceremonial oils and handling. Beside it, a small book bound in what appeared to be human skin. "I can't read the language," I admitted, examining the book's faded script. "You don't need to read it. It needs to read you." She closed my fingers around the book. "Keep it close to your blood. It will tell you what must be done when the moment comes." That night, I slept soundly for the first time in weeks, protected by Shanodithit's home and whatever power recognized my grandmother's influence. In my dreams, I stood in a vast, dark forest clearing with the previous ranger, Thomas Mills. "You understand now," he said, his form flickering between wholeness and something scattered, fragmented. "Why I left those journals, why I circled your cabin." "You knew what was happening," I replied. "You tried to warn me," he smiled sadly. "I tried to prepare you. There's a difference." His image destabilized further. "It's wearing me thin now, using my memories, my voice, my mannerisms to hunt. Soon nothing of me will remain except what it chooses to mimic." "How do I stop it?" "You already have what you need." He gestured to my marked palm. "Blood recognizes blood. Boundaries accept boundaries." As he faded entirely, his voice lingered. "Find where it first broke through. The trapper's cabin. The original threshold." I woke with new purpose and terrible clarity. To stop this entity, I needed to return to where it all began, not the researchers' camp, but somewhere older, deeper in the forbidden forest. The place where Nathan Holloway had first invited the ancient hunger to cross into our world. Armed with Shanodithit's protection, the obsidian knife, and the skin-bound book, I began my journey back into the heart of the forest. The elder had provided additional supplies, a mixture of herbs to burn that would temporarily reveal hidden pathways, salt and iron filings for emergency barriers, and a small bone whistle that would call to those who remember the old agreements. I moved cautiously, avoiding known ranger patrol routes. Twice I spotted vehicles in the distance, my colleagues searching for me, or things wearing their forms. Once I heard my name called through a bullhorn, Gerald's voice claiming I was needed for an urgent situation. I pressed deeper into the wilderness, away from such obvious traps. The skin-bound book pressed against my chest where I'd secured it in an inner pocket. Occasionally it seemed to pulse with a rhythm independent of my heartbeat, as if responding to proximity to something unseen. The symbols on my palm and forearm sometimes burned, sometimes froze, but never faded. Navigating to the trapper's cabin proved challenging. It appeared on no official maps, expunged from park records after the incidents in the 70s. I relied on fragmented information from Shanawdithit, Thomas Mill's journals, and increasingly, intuition that felt externally guided. On the third day, I noticed the wildlife had completely vanished. No birds overhead, no insects in the undergrowth, no small mammals scurrying through fallen leaves. The silence was absolute except for my own movement and breathing. As evening approached, I found myself in a valley I'd never seen before, though I'd patrolled this region for months. The trees grew abnormally close together, their bark blackened as if by old fire, their branches intertwining to block most light. At the valley's center stood a small, dilapidated cabin, more a shack than a proper structure. Its walls leaned at unstable angles, the roof partially collapsed. Around it, the ground appeared scorched in a perfect circle, nothing growing within that boundary. Nailed to the trees surrounding the clearing were dozens of animal skulls, some recognizable as deer, wolf, or bear, others distorted beyond identification. This was Holloway's place. The threshold. I made camp a safe distance away, creating a circle of salt and iron before burning the herbs Shanawdithit had provided. The smoke rose in unnatural patterns, forming symbols similar to those marked on my skin before dissipating. Through the smoke, I could see faint pathways glowing in the gathering darkness, spirit roads or energy lines connecting the trapper's cabin to various points deeper in the forest, and worryingly, to distant locations including my own ranger cabin. The entity had created a network, expanding from this central point. As night fell completely, the forest came alive with movement. Shadowy figures with elongated limbs and fluid forms circled my protective boundary, testing its strength. They wore partial appearances. A ranger's uniform hat, topping an impossibly tall, emaciated body. A hiker's backpack carried by something moving on too many legs. A child's face atop an adult's body that bent backward at the waist. They called to me in voices that shifted mid-word between different people I knew. Sometimes they spoke in unison, sometimes argued among themselves. Always, they invited me to step outside the circle. "You can't stay in there forever," they reasoned, using my grandmother's gentle tone before shifting to Gerald's authoritative bark. "You'll need to sleep eventually." I removed the skin-bound book from my pocket. It vibrated against my hand, the cover warm and disturbingly supple. When I opened it, the pages appeared blank until a drop of sweat fell from my forehead onto the parchment. The liquid spread, forming words in English though the script remained foreign. The wearer of skins fears what it cannot wear. The boundary must be redrawn with willing blood and unwilling bone. I understood with sudden clarity. Holloway had broken the ancient boundaries containing this entity by offering blood sacrifices, animal at first, then human. To restore those boundaries, a sacrifice was still required, but of a different nature. Just before dawn, I stepped out of my protective circle, obsidian knife in hand. The shadows that had retreated with the first light immediately surged forward, converging on me from all directions. I ran toward the trapper's cabin, their pursuit close behind. Inside, the cabin's single room contained disturbing evidence of Holloway's descent into madness. The walls were covered with symbols similar to those in the skin book, painted in what could only be blood. Animal pelts, some obviously human, hung from the ceiling beams. A large table dominated the center, its surface stained dark. Deep grooves carved to channel fluids toward a collection basin. In the room's center, barely visible beneath years of dust, lay a circular pattern carved into the floorboards. I brushed away the grime to reveal an intricate design, a boundary circle but inverted. Where traditional protective circles keep things out, this one had been designed to draw things in. Outside, the entities converged on the cabin. Their forms flickered between appearances, unable to maintain consistent shapes as they approached the threshold. The walls shook with their eagerness. I knelt beside the carved circle and placed the skin-bound book at its center. The knife felt impossibly heavy in my hand as understanding crystallized. The willing blood had to be mine. The unwilling bone belonged to the one who had broken the original boundary. Somewhere in this cabin, Holloway's remains must still exist. Not his consumed flesh, but something more permanent. I tore through the rotting furniture, searched beneath floorboards, until finally I found a small metal box wedged between wall studs. Inside lay a yellowed human skull, strange symbols carved into the bone. The entities outside grew frenzied, sensing what I intended. The cabin walls bulged inward as they pressed against the structure from all sides. Wood splintered. Nails shrieked as they pulled free. I placed Holloway's skull in the center of the inverted circle beside the book. The bone whistle Shanardith it had given me began to vibrate in my pocket. When I removed it, it leapt from my fingers to hover in the air before me. With no breath to activate it, the whistle nevertheless emitted a sound beyond hearing, felt rather than heard, a pressure wave that momentarily froze the attacking entities. The book flipped open, pages turning by themselves until they settled on one covered with symbols matching those on my palm. The pattern expanded visually, growing to match the inverted circle on the floor. I understood what was required. With the obsidian knife, I cut deeply across my marked palm. Blood welled immediately, dripping onto the circle, the book, and Holloway's skull. Where it touched, the symbols glowed with internal light. "I am Ahanu Black Wolf," I declared to the pressing darkness, grandson of Mingan Black Wolf of the Southern Blackfoot Nation. I stand at the threshold as guardian, not gateway. The entities outside howled with a single voice, a sound of ancient hunger and frustration. By willing blood and unwilling bone, I restore what was broken. The words came without conscious thought, rising from the book through my blood to my lips. What was invited is now banished. What was released is now bound. I placed my bleeding palm directly on Holloway's skull. The connection completed the circuit. Power surged through the symbols, through my blood, through the inverted circle. The cabin filled with blinding light as the boundary reformed, not just around this location, but across the network of connections I'd seen earlier. The entities screamed as they were pulled back from the world, forced through the threshold and sealed behind it. The inverted circle, designed by Holloway to bring them in, now served as the drain through which they were expelled. The pressure, built until the cabin itself began to disintegrate around me. I clutched the skull and book to my chest as the structure collapsed, the light reaching unbearable intensity. Then silence. Absolute and complete. I awoke surrounded by the scattered remnants of the cabin. The forest had returned to normal. Birds, called insects, buzzed. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves. Where the inverted circle had been, only scorched earth remained. The skull had crumbled to dust. The skin-bound book had sealed itself, its cover now weathered and cracked like ancient leather. The marks on my palm had changed, forming a different pattern. No longer a protective ward, but a key. A reminder, a responsibility. I made my way back to civilization slowly, unsure what I would find. Had the entities taken others before I closed the threshold? How many rangers, researchers, hikers now wore false skins, harboring fragments of the ancient hunger? When I finally reached Ranger headquarters 3 days later, I found controlled chaos. Search parties had been scouring the park for me and the missing researchers. Gerald looked up from a map, his face showing genuine relief when he saw me. "Black Wolf, where the hell have you been? We've had teams looking everywhere." His movements were natural, his expressions authentic. The researchers had been found wandering near a different sector, dehydrated and confused, but otherwise unharmed. They remembered nothing after setting up their original camp. In my official report, I documented finding them disoriented from carbon monoxide poisoning due to an improperly ventilated camp stove. My own disappearance I attributed to becoming lost while tracking unusual animal behavior. Simple, believable explanations that raised no alarms. The truth I kept to myself, though I quietly arranged a transfer to a different park. The boundary had been restored, but some boundaries require constant attention. Some thresholds need guardians. I still work as a ranger, though now in Olympic National Park. My small cabin sits on the edge of a rainforest older than human memory. At night, I sometimes hear voices calling from the darkness, familiar voices with familiar hungers. I trace the symbols on my palm and remember what waits beyond poorly maintained boundaries. I remember the price of forgetting ancient agreements. The skin-bound book sits in a locked chest beneath my bed. Sometimes I wake to find it has moved slightly, reorienting itself toward distant Alaska. On those mornings, I check the symbols on my palm and find them subtly altered, a warning system more reliable than any technology. The boundary holds for now, but hunger is patient, and memory is long in the deep woods. Sometimes on moonless nights, I stand at the edge of my yard and listen to the forest's whispered promises. I remember the ancient hunger that waits beyond safe paths. I remember how it spoke with my voice, wore familiar faces, and nearly claimed my skin as its own. I am a Hanu black wolf, and I guard the threshold. I maintain the boundary between worlds with willing blood and vigilant eyes. And I never, ever respond when something calls my name after dark. I never thought of myself as the kind of guy who'd get lost in the middle of nowhere, especially not on a simple weekend road trip. But that's exactly what happened to me that fateful autumn day in 2016. I've always loved taking backroads journeys when I had a few days off from my hardware store job. It was my escape, a chance to explore parts of the country most folks don't even know exist. The plan this time was straightforward enough. Drive down to Kentucky, spend a couple days catching up with my buddy Rick at his place in the hills, grill some steaks, drink a few beers, then head back home to Indiana. Easy peasy, or so I thought. My first mistake was taking the wrong highway exit in my hurry to beat the evening traffic. I'd driven this way before to visit Rick, but somehow I ended up on an unfamiliar gravel road that soon turned into more of a rutted dirt path. No big deal, I figured. I had time and wasn't in a rush. Surely this backwoods route would loop around and spit me back out onto a main road eventually. But as the sun began its slow dip below the treetops, my confidence started to waver. The dense Kentucky woods pressed in close on both sides of the narrow lane, tall pines and gnarled oaks forming a claustrophobic tunnel. An eerie quiet hung in the air, broken only by the crunch of my tires and the whisper of a chill breeze through browning leaves. Not even a bird call broke the stillness. Then, as if on cue, my trusty old pickup truck sputtered, coughed, and coasted to a dead stop, the engine cutting out completely. I muttered a few choice words as I turned the key desperately back and forth. No luck. I'm no mechanic, but I know my way around an engine. Popping the hood, I poked around, hoping for a quick fix, but everything looked in order to my untrained eye. No cell signal either, of course. Par for the course this far out in the sticks. With a sinking feeling, I surveyed my limited options as the shadows lengthened. I could sit tight with the truck and hope some local would happen by. Or I could strike out on foot, flashlight in hand, praying I'd stumble across a farmhouse or ranger station before full dark. In the moment, walking seemed the less terrible choice. I mean, people did live out here in the boondocks, right? Locking up the pickup, I set off down the path at a brisk clip, fallen leaves scuffing under my boots, the beam of my flashlight dancing through the underbrush. Ahead, The dirt track twisted and turned, drawing me deeper into the darkening forest. Minutes stretched into an hour, then more. No sign of civilization, not even a damn squirrel. Just the trees, the gathering dusk, and a growing unease prickling at the back of my neck. I was debating turning back to the cold comfort of my truck when I spotted it through the gloom. A house. Well, the dilapidated remains of one anyhow. I approached cautiously, picking my way through waist-high weeds. The place was clearly long abandoned, its roof partially caved in, windows busted out, the rotting porch steps groaning ominously underfoot. Still, I had to check. Maybe I'd get lucky and find an ancient landline inside. At this point, I'd take smoke signals if it got me out of this mess. Shouldering open the crumbling front door, I swept my light around what had once been a living room. Water-stained wallpaper peeled above heaps of leaf litter, shattered furniture, and animal scat. A rusted wagon wheel leaned in one corner beside a soot-blackened brick fireplace. Clearly no one had called this wreck home for decades. I was turning to leave, resigned to my fate, when a floorboard creaked oddly underfoot. Crouching down, I brushed aside a moldy scrap of carpet to reveal a crude trapdoor. A rusted metal ring served as a handle. My gut screamed to leave it the hell alone, but desperate times and all that. Pulse quickening, I heaved the hatch open. Stale, frigid air wafted up from a black gap. Cellar stairs led down into the abyss. Dank stone walls glistened with moisture in my flashlight's wavering glow as I crept down the steps, ducking under cobwebs. A dirt floor, a few broken barrels, some ancient rusted tools. I started to relax. A whole lot of nothing. Then my beam landed on the corner, and my blood turned to ice in my veins. Bones. Human bones, protruding from the damp earth in a dirty pile like a charnel house exhibit. Some looked bleached with age, others disturbingly fresh, tatters of rotting flesh and fabric still clinging to them. A scream rose up in my throat, but terror throttled it to a choked gurgle. What the unholy hell had I stumbled into? And then behind me, from the top of the stairs, a floorboard creaked. Sheer animal instinct took over. I hit the flashlight and threw myself into a crouch behind a crumbling stone wall, pulse pounding like a war drum in my ears. Adrenaline surging, I pressed myself against the cold, clammy masonry, barely daring to breathe. On some primal level, my body understood what my mind was still struggling to accept. I wasn't alone down here. And whoever had just crept down those cellar steps had zero intent to offer the welcome wagon. Gripping my extinguished flashlight like a club, my muscles coiled tight, ready to spring into panicked action at the slightest provocation. Seconds ticked by with agonizing slowness as I strained my senses against the suffocating darkness. Shuffling footsteps, moving carefully from the base of the stairwell into the room. The soft scrape of something heavy, metallic, being dragged across the packed dirt floor. A muted thump as an unseen object was set down. Then a voice barely more than a gravelly whisper, echoing off the stone walls. "Come on out now. I know you're in here." Every hair on my body stood erect at the sound. He knew. Somehow the sick bastard knew I was here, cowering in my hidey hole, a heartbeat away from pissing my pants in terror. Licking bone-dry lips with a sandpaper tongue, I stayed perfectly still, unwilling to confirm my presence until I absolutely had to. A harsh chuckle, utterly devoid of humor. The slow, steady footsteps began circling the cellar's perimeter, drawing steadily closer to my position. "Smell your fear, boy." Smelled it the second you cracked that door. Grimy fingernails dug into the decaying stonework inches from my face as a dark shape loomed around the corner of the wall. I caught a glimpse of ragged clumps of beard, pitted leathery skin, and black holes for eyes that swallowed the scant light. A jagged grin split the feral face as the hulking figure stopped and stared directly at my position. "Gotcha." He moved with inhuman speed, a massive paw shooting out to clamp around my windpipe with a grip like iron. I lurched back, gagging, kicking out wildly as I was hauled bodily out from behind the wall. Stars exploded across my vision as I was slammed against the floor. the back of my skull impacting with a sickening crack. Stunned, wheezing, I scrabbled desperately at the gnarled fingers throttling the life from me. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glint of rusted steel. Some corner of my racing mind processed an image of the giant wielding an antique railroad spike, raising it high overhead with clear intent to dash my brains across the cellar floor. Survival instinct surged through my battered body like an electric current. With a wordless bellow of unhinged fear and fury, I twisted like an eel, wrenching to the side just as the crude hammer descended. A line of fire seared across my temple a heartbeat before the spike smashed into the ground, throwing up a spray of dirt. Impossibly, the glancing blow seemed to loosen my attacker's grip for the merest instant. Sucking in a raw, ragged lungful of dank air, I groped out blindly, seizing the first object that came to hand, a heavy, rusted pry bar. Unleashing a crazed howl, I laid into the towering maniac with every ounce of desperate strength left in my battered body. Once, twice, 3 times I brought the weighty steel bar crashing down, not caring where I struck, just flailing with mindless savagery until I felt the choking press of fingers fall slack from my throat. Rolling sideways, retching and gasping, I fumbled for my flashlight. Terrified I'd only stunned the hulking monster. The flickering beam played across a glistening pool of dark blood and a motionless bearded face, one side caved in like a rotten jack-o'-lantern. A final wet rattle escaped from slack lips as clouding eyes stared sightlessly at the earthen ceiling. Shuddering violently, every nerve raw and jangling, I lurched to my feet, swaying like a drunk as I staggered for the stairs. My battered mind reeled, struggling to process the sheer bloody unreality of the last 5 minutes. All I knew was that I had to get out, had to escape this madness before it dragged me down forever. Floorboards shattered under my clumsy, stomping boots as I burst into the ruined house above, heedless of the noise. Whimpering like a beaten cur, I made a limping beeline for the sagging front door, and what I prayed was a clear path back to the sanity of civilization. I nearly made it too. Would have, if my wild, roving flashlight beam hadn't illuminated a half-dozen ragged, dirt-smeared figures emerging from the tree line, all clutching various wicked-looking blades, bludgeons, and farm implements, all wearing the same demonic grins as the thing bleeding out in the basement. A strangled howl of raw animal fear rose unbidden in my chest as they began to lope toward the house. And for a single, oddly lucid instant, one coherent thought crystallized in my fracturing psyche. I was going to die horribly in these godforsaken woods, and no one would ever find my bones. The mind does funny things when death is bearing down on you at a dead sprint, yellowed teeth bared in a rictus snarl. Time seemed to slow to a molasses crawl as I stood frozen in the doorway of that ramshackle ruin, watching the pack of feral hillfolk close the distance with tendon-stretching strides. In that crystalline moment of pure, ice-cold terror, a deluge of regrets, what-ifs, and unfinished business crashed through my short-circuiting brain with merciless clarity. I saw my mom's face crumpling when the cops arrived to break the news. My kid brother, stoically taking the mantle as man of the house. My dad, already a decade in the ground, silently judging my failures from beyond the pale. Something broke inside me then, some integral pillar of sanity and reason that had been slowly eroding since I first stepped foot on this cursed patch of backwoods dirt. A red haze settled over my vision. A roaring static flooded my ears, and the gagging stench of rancid fear sweat saturated my senses. At the heart of that maelstrom, a spark of defiance flared to life. To hell with this. If I was going out, it wouldn't be as a sniveling victim. If these sick bastards wanted a hunt, I'd give them one they'd never forget. Lips skinning back in a feral snarl of my own, I ripped the flashlight from my belt and sent it sailing end over end into the face of the lead psycho, a wiry, hatchet-wielding fiend covered in ritual scars. The hefty metal cylinder struck with a meaty crunch. pulping the maniac's nose and sending him tumbling backwards with a gurgling howl. The knot of pursuers faltered for a beat, yipping and snarling as they stumbled over their writhing compatriot. I wasted no time in capitalizing on the momentary break. Wrenching around, I kicked the rotting door off its rusted hinges and barreled back into the house's dank interior, vaulting mounds of mouldering debris as I plunged deeper into the gloom. Enraged howls and the thunder of stomping feet dogged my heels as I crashed through a rear door into some sort of mudroom or pantry. Animal instinct guided me toward a small, filthy window above a desiccated sink. Seized by a feral desperation, I threw my entire weight behind a shoulder charge, blasting through the decaying wood and showering myself in a hail of splinters and glass shards. I hit the ground outside in a graceless belly flop, the wind exploding from my lungs in a groaning whoosh. Clawing for breath, I jerked to my hands and knees, shaking my head to clear the stars whirling in my vision. In the faint moonlight filtering through the dense branches overhead, I could make out the deep muck of fetid mud I'd landed in, the kind that could steal a man's boots given half a chance. Squelching and struggling, I fought to extricate myself from the clinging morass before my pursuers caught up. The brittle snap of splintering wood and a chorus of baying howls somewhere behind the house told me that my lead had just evaporated. Terror sent a fresh jolt of manic strength surging through my aching muscles as I finally ripped free of the mud's clutches. I took off at a shambling run, crashing haphazardly through the underbrush, thorny branches raking at my face and arms, exposed roots snatching at my ankles. Only blind luck and a moonbeam kept me from braining myself on a low-hanging limb or pitching face first into some hidden ravine. There was no strategy to my mad flight. Just a base animal imperative to put as much distance as possible between me and the bloodthirsty freak stalking my scent. My heart felt like it was about to explode out of my chest, ragged gasps sawing at my raw throat as my burning legs churned relentlessly onward. The howls and screams never faded as I plunged deeper into the lightless tangle of trees and vines. If anything, they seemed to be growing closer, hungrier. My mind spun with visions of grasping claws and flashing blades, of an agonizing savage death alone in this dark wood. I don't know how long I ran like that, a blind, stumbling puppet dancing on adrenaline-fueled strings. The forest had swallowed every shred of civilization, even the faintest echo of a distant highway. For all I knew, I was lost in some hellish twilight zone that existed beyond the reach of sane reality. Maybe I died back in that rancid cellar after all, and this was my eternal torment. It was the light that finally reached through the delirium and shocked a sliver of awareness back into my animal brain. Golden light spilling from the windows of a small cabin crouched in a clearing ahead. Salvation, shelter, another human being who might just be able to yank me out of this spiraling insanity before those hills gave birth to some fresh horror. A wordless, croaking plea burbled out of my dust-dry throat as I veered toward the beacon of hope. I fixed my eyes on that warm yellow glow, using it to orient my madly spiraling senses as I stumbled into the open ground. Gravel. I felt gravel and cracked asphalt beneath the shredded soles of my boots. A road, an honest-to-God road, and at the end of it, a battered pickup truck parked beside a rough-hewn cabin. I risked a glance over my shoulder, hoping against hope that the change of scenery had somehow thrown my dogged pursuers off the scent. No such luck. Dark, scuttling figures poured from the tree line like a horde of overgrown insects, hooting and baying in a fever pitch of bloodlust. They fanned out in a rough semicircle, cutting off any path of retreat. This was it, the final stand. With the absolute last shred of energy left in my battered frame, I lunged up the cabin's weathered porch steps and began pounding on the front door like a man possessed. Words spilled from me in an incoherent jumble, as much howl as speech. Help! For the love of God, help me! They're coming! From within the rough pine door, the distinctive clack-clack of a shotgun being racked reached my ears. An instant, An instant later, the door was wrenched open to reveal a grizzled, wild-haired man in stained overalls, a battered 10-gauge leveled squarely at my chest. Pale blue eyes, sharp as flint, raked me from head to toe, taking in my mud-splattered, blood-streaked form in a single sweep. For a heartbeat, I thought he might pull the trigger on pure reflex. "What in the name of all that's holy?" he started, his voice a low, hawkish rasp. "No time," I gasped out, stabbing a finger back the way I'd come. "They're right behind me. We have to." A blood-curdling shriek ripped through the night, far too close for comfort. The old man's head snapped up, zeroing in on the threat with a predator's focus. Without a word, he stepped out onto the porch, planting himself at the top of the steps as he raised the shotgun to his shoulder. I scuttled around behind him, instinctively putting his bulk between me and the oncoming horde. Trembling from head to toe, I gripped the weathered railing for support, my heart a jackhammer in my chest. The ragged pack had halted at the edge of the clearing, milling and gibbering in a rough semicircle. They made no move to close the distance, yet. The old man racked the shotgun slide with an authoritative clack-clack, the sound like a peal of doom in the charged air. "That's far enough. Ye degenerate bastards," he growled, his voice pitched to carry. "This here's private property. I'm well within my rights to ventilate anyone who takes another step." A jagged chorus of yips and hisses rippled through the throng, underscored by the scrape of metal and the wet smacks of flesh on flesh. At some unseen signal, the mob began to spread out, slowly fanning to either side of the cabin. Trying to flank us, I realized with a fresh shock of gut-churning terror. "They're not going to stop," I croaked, my mouth bone dry. "We have to get inside, call for help, something." The old man's shoulders tensed, but he kept the shotgun trained on the center mass of the pack. "Ain't no help to call, son," he said, his voice grim as a reaper's blade. "Phones are down and the sheriff's an hour away on a good day. We're on our own here." As if to punctuate his point, a figure suddenly detached from the milling horde and came loping up the gravel drive, a rusted scythe held high. The old man tracked the movement with the muzzle of his gun, his finger hovering over the trigger guard. "Last warning," he barked. "Next step's your last." The scythe-wielding maniac threw back his head and loosed a gurgling cackle, ropes of ropey saliva gleaming in the moonlight. Then, with a spine-chilling howl, he charged straight at us, a one-man wave of flashing steel and savage intent. The old man squeezed the trigger. The shotgun roared like a cannon in the confines of the porch. The scythe-wielder's chest blew open like a rotten melon, sending him pinwheeling backwards in a spray of blood and shredded tissue. He hit the ground in a tangled heap and lay still, his limbs twitching spasmodically. The echoes of the blast were still ringing in my ears when the rest of the pack exploded into motion, howling and screaming as they surged forward en masse. The old man worked the slide with grim efficiency, sending blast after blast into the seething tide of bodies. Gouts of blood misted the night air, mingling with the stench of cordite and burning powder. But there were too many, coming too fast. A thrown hatchet clanged off the porch railing inches from my face, sending me reeling back with a yelp. Another stuck quivering in the cabin's doorframe, its half still vibrating from the force of the impact. "Inside now," the old man roared, backpedaling furiously as he slapped fresh shells into the breach. "Bar the door and pray to whatever god you believe in." I didn't need to be told twice. Throwing my weight against the heavy pine, I shouldered it open and all but fell into the cabin's dimly lit interior. A heartbeat later, the old man backed through the opening, still peppering the front yard with buckshot as he crossed the threshold. Together, we rammed the door shut and drove home a massive iron bolt just as the first bodies slammed against it from the other side. The aged timbers groaned under the impact, but held fast, for the moment at least. Chest heaving, I sagged against the rough-hewn wall, my mind reeling as it tried to process the sheer, unmitigated insanity of the last few minutes. The old man was already moving, rummaging through a battered sideboard with quick, efficient motions. "Catch," he said, tossing me a scratched walnut handle protruding from a cracked leather holster. I caught the object reflexively, my hand closing around the grip of a massive revolver that looked old enough to have come west with Wyatt Earp. Ever shot a gun before? The query was punctuated by a meaty thud as something heavy slammed against the door, setting the hinges to creaking. Once or twice, I managed, my voice sounding thin and thready to my own ears. I fumbled with the latch on the holster, my blood-slicked fingers clumsy on the stiff leather. Good. Because unless I miss my guess, we're about to have us a regular Alamo situation here. As if on cue, the cabin's lone window shattered inward in a spray of glass shards and splintered wood. A grasping claw-like hand thrust through the opening, groping blindly in the dim light. And the night erupted into a cacophony of gunfire, screams, and shattering wood. Time blurred into a red-tinged fog of adrenaline and cordite as we fought tooth and nail to keep the ravening horde at bay. The old man moved with the fluid grace of a much younger fighter, his shotgun roaring like the wrath of an angry god. I did my best to follow his lead, the massive revolver bucking and leaping in my white-knuckled grip as I sent round after heavy round into the press of bodies. We worked in desperate tandem, one of us laying down a withering barrage as the other reloaded, trading off as the situation demanded. But for every frothing psychopath we put down, two more seemed to surge forward to take their place, heedless of the carnage we were dealing to their ranks. Splintered wood and shattered glass soon carpeted the floor, crunching underfoot as we wove a frantic dance between the cabin's makeshift choke points. Blood painted the walls in violent Jackson Pollock spatters, its cloying, coppery tang mingling with the acrid reek of gun smoke and raw terror sweat. Time and again, the ragged mob almost breached our crumbling defenses, only to be driven back at the last possible second by a point-blank blast of buckshot or a desperately placed pistol round. But each surge took its toll, sapping our already waning reserves of ammunition and willpower. The creeping realization of our own mortality hung thick as grave dirt in the air. I was in the process of fumbling a handful of shells into the shotgun's smoking breech when the old man abruptly stiffened, his head cocking at an odd angle. For a beat I thought he'd been hit, but then I registered the shocking absence of sound from outside the splintered walls. The furious din of the assault had petered out like someone thrown a switch, leaving only the ragged rasp of our labored breathing and the tinny whine of my adrenaline-jacked ears. What's happening?" I croaked, my voice rough as shattered glass from all the shouting and gun smoke. "Why'd they stop?" The old man shook his head, his expression unreadable in the guttering light of the cabin's single remaining lantern. With a Herculean effort, he levered his bulk over to one of the shot-out windows and chanced a quick peek through the jagged opening. I saw his shoulders slump a fraction before he turned back to me. "They're gone." 2 words, spoken with the leaden finality of a coffin lid slamming shut. I stared at him in naked incomprehension, my mind struggling to wrap itself around the concept. It didn't seem possible, not after the relentless, almost preternatural ferocity of the assault we'd just endured. "What do you mean, gone?" I demanded, an edge of hysteria creeping into my voice. "They were just trying to tear us apart with their bare hands, and now they're what? Bored? This doesn't make any—" I trailed off as my sluggish brain finally processed the silvery quality of the light filtering through the cabin's ruptured walls. Dawn. Somehow, impossibly, we'd managed to hold out until sunrise. The night's horrors were over, banished by the first pale rays of the coming day. A sound halfway between a sob and a laugh bubbled up my raw throat as I sagged back against the blood-spattered wall. We'd made it. Against all odds and in defiance of all sane reason, we'd weathered the devil's own storm. I looked over at the old man, intending to share in this moment of bone-deep relief, only to pull up short at his grim expression. "They'll be back," he said flatly. his flinty eyes meeting my own haunted gaze without flinching. Maybe not tonight or the next, but they'll come again. They always do. Something in his voice, some undefinable quality of weary resignation, told me he was speaking from bitter, hard-won experience. This wasn't the first time he'd stared down the abyss and watched it blink. Probably wouldn't be the last either. Suddenly exhausted beyond all reckoning, I let the revolver slip from my nerveless fingers and clatter to the blood-slicked floor. 1,000 questions whirled through my head, each more urgent and unanswerable than the last. What the hell were those things out there? How long had they been stalking these woods, preying on the unwary and the lost? And most importantly, what did we do now? But those were worries for another time, another place. Now, as the first golden rays of the morning sun crept across the porch, all I could think about was putting as many miles between me and this accursed stretch of backwoods as my battered truck could manage. The old man seemed to read my intent in my haunted 1,000-yard stare. Slinging the shotgun over his shoulder, he reached out and clasped my shoulder in a grip that was half comradely, half ominous portent. "You'll be back too," he said, his voice a low, prophetic rumble. "This place, it gets in your blood, under your skin, calls to you when you lay down to sleep at night. You'll see." Then, with a final nod that could have meant anything, he turned and limped off into the brightening day, leaving me alone with the cooling corpses and the echoing report of gunfire still ringing in my ears. Somehow, I found the strength to stagger out to my truck, slumping behind the wheel like a puppet with its strings cut. The old Ford started up on the first try, its throaty rumble the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. Gravel sprayed from beneath the tires as I wrenched the wheel around, aiming the hood at the distant promise of civilization and sanity. And as I watched the cabin recede in my rear-view mirror, the road rolling away beneath my wheels like a coiled strap, a single thought crystallized in my battered psyche with the force of irrational conviction. The old man was right. I would be back. Maybe not today, maybe not for years to come, but someday, when the nightmares had faded and the scars had healed, I would return to this dark place of blood and terror, because in some sick, twisted way, it had become a part of me, a festering splinter of madness lodged in my very soul, and no amount of miles or sunrises could ever pry it loose. The road beckoned, two endless lines of weathered asphalt reaching into a future I could no longer see. And like a moth drawn helplessly to an open flame, I bore down on the gas pedal and drove, chasing a horizon stained forever crimson in my mind.